Please marry me. The words were a ghost of a sound, lost in the cold, thick mud of the main street. They were spoken into the worn leather of a giant's boots, by a woman kneeling in the filth. Her name was Leanne, and she was 20 years old, a fragile doll lost in a world of granite and steel. The light pink silk of her cheongsam, a dress meant for celebration and honor, was stained with the grime of the frontier town, its delicate embroidery frayed and broken. Around her, a circle of faces, weathered and cruel, twisted in amusement. They laughed, the sound sharp and ugly, like stones rattling in a tin can. Men in dusty hats and women in drab, colorless frocks pointed and jeered, their scorn a physical force that pressed her further into the mire. Overseeing the spectacle was Sheriff Brody, a man whose smile never reached his eyes. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, a badge glinting on his chest, a symbol not of justice, but of ownership. He was the ringmaster of her humiliation, and he savored every moment. Into this tableau of casual cruelty rode Jonas. He was a man who seemed carved from the mountain itself, immense and silent, with a cascade of dark hair and a thick beard that hid his expression. He sat astride a powerful brown horse, its breath pluming in the frigid air, as out of place in the cramped, muddy street as a great bear. He had come for salt, flour, and coffee, a rare trip down from his solitary kingdom in the high peaks. He had intended to be invisible, a shadow moving through the town before retreating back to the silence he called home. But he was not invisible. To Leanne, he was a landmark, a sudden peak of strength in a flat and hopeless landscape. She saw the way the mocking crowd instinctively parted for him, the way their jeers faltered into uneasy murmurs. In him, she did not see a stranger, she saw an escape. With a final, desperate surge of will, she scrambled from the clutches of Brody's deputy, stumbling through the mud and falling at the feet of the mountain man's horse. She clung to his boot, her cheek pressed against the cold, damp leather, and repeated her impossible plea. "Please," she whispered again, her voice raw with a terror that went far beyond the shame of the moment. "Marry me." Leanne's journey to this muddy street had begun with a lie, a beautiful and intoxicating promise whispered across an ocean. She was an orphan from a small village, promised in a letter to a Chinese merchant who had found success in the New World. The letter, penned by a matchmaker, spoke of a fine house, of respect, of a life where she would be cherished and want for nothing. Her dowry had been the last of her family's savings, and she had boarded the ship with a heart full of fragile hope. The man who met her at the port was not the prosperous merchant from the letters. He was old, sick, and defeated, his dreams long since turned to dust in the harsh, unforgiving soil of the West. His fine house was a rented room at the back of a laundry, and his success was a mountain of debt owed to the most powerful man in the territory, Sheriff Brody. Within a month, the merchant was dead, his cough finally stealing the last of his breath. Leanne was left with nothing but his debts and the worn pink cheongsam she had saved for her wedding day. Brody had arrived not with condolences, but with a ledger and a contract. The merchant's debt, he explained with a chilling lack of emotion, was now hers. The passage, her food, her very existence, it was all tallied in his book. She was his property until the debt was paid, an impossible sum she could never hope to earn. Her life became a quiet nightmare. She was made to serve drinks at the saloon, her hands trembling as she endured the leering stares and crude remarks of the patrons. Brody paraded her as his exotic prize, a delicate piece of porcelain he intended to sell to the highest bidder. He spoke of a rich rancher from the south who was looking for a new wife, a man known for his cruelty. Brody was simply waiting for the man's arrival, enjoying the spectacle of her despair in the meantime. The daily walk through town was a ritual of degradation he orchestrated, a reminder to everyone, especially her, of her place. She was not a person. She was a commodity. Kneeling in the mud before the silent mountain man was not an act of romantic desperation. It was the last, wild gamble of a soul with nothing left to lose. She was not asking for love, she was begging for sanctuary, for a different kind of cage, perhaps, but one whose bars were not forged by the smug cruelty of Sheriff Brody. The laughter from the crowd swelled, a wave of derision washing over Leanne's small, kneeling form. "Hear that, boys?" Brody called out, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "The little sparrow wants a new perch. And she's picked the biggest, ugliest tree on the mountain." He swaggered forward, his boots squelching in the mud, and grabbed Leanne's arm, hauling her roughly to her feet. The silk of her sleeve tore slightly under his grip. "She belongs to me, mountain man," Brody snarled, shoving his face toward Jonas. "Her debt is mine. Her contract is mine. So you get back on that big horse of yours and ride on out of here before you get involved in business that doesn't concern you." Jonas did not look at Brody. His gaze was fixed downward, on the woman swaying on her feet before him. He saw the faint, purpled marks of old bruises on her wrist, now joined by the angry red imprints of Brody's fingers. He saw the terror in her dark eyes, a terror so profound it seemed to eclipse everything else in the dreary street. But beneath it, he saw something else, something he recognized with a jolt that went deeper than the winter cold, a flicker of defiance, the last ember of a fire that refused to be extinguished. In her face, he saw a reflection of a pain he knew intimately, the pain of being judged, of being an outsider, of being utterly alone against a world that did not care. The crowd waited, hungry for the next chapter of the drama. They expected the giant to grunt, to shrug, to turn his horse and retreat to the wild, leaving the girl to her fate. That was the way of things. But Jonas did something else. With a slow, deliberate movement, he swung his leg over his horse and dismounted. He landed with a soft thud, but his presence seemed to shake the very ground. The sheer scale of him was suddenly overwhelming without the horse beneath him. He was taller, broader, more solid than any man there. The laughter died in their throats, replaced by a sudden, collective intake of breath. The air grew still. He took a step forward, his shadow falling over both Leanne and the sheriff. He looked directly at Brody, and for the first time, his expression was clear. There was no anger, no rage, just a calm, unshakable certainty that was more intimidating than any threat. "Let her go," he said. The voice was not loud, but it rumbled with the weight of stone and time, a low vibration that every person in the street felt in their chest. Brody's smirk faltered. Then, Jonas's gaze softened as it fell upon Leanne. "Get up," he said, his tone changing, losing its hard edge. "You're coming with me." Sheriff Brody's face flushed a dark, mottled red, a mixture of fury and disbelief. He tightened his grip on Leanne's arm, pulling her back. "The hell she is. I have a legal claim." "You can't just—" Jonas took another step, closing the space between them. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't make a threat. He simply looked at the sheriff's hand on Leanne's arm, a look of such profound and final disapproval that Brody's fingers loosened instinctively, as if they'd been burned. Leanne stumbled forward, free. Without a word, Jonas reached down, his large hand surprisingly gentle as he cupped her elbows and lifted her. She was as light as a child. He turned and placed her on the back of his horse, Balthazar, settling her sideways on the saddle. She clung to the worn pommel, her heart hammering against her ribs, a wild mix of terror and a strange, dawning hope. Jonas then swung himself up behind her, his body a solid wall of warmth against her back. He gathered the reins, his movements fluid and economical. "This isn't over, Jonas!" Brody shrieked, his composure finally shattering. He was a man accustomed to being feared, and this quiet, absolute dismissal was an insult he couldn't bear. "I'll have the law on you. I'll have a posse. You can't hide from the law." Jonas didn't look back. He nudged Balthazar's flanks, and the great horse moved forward, parting the stunned crowd as if it were water. They rode out of the town, leaving the muddy street, the jeering faces, and the sheriff's impotent rage behind them. The silence of the wilderness enveloped them almost immediately. The only sounds were the rhythmic clopping of Balthazar's hooves and the sigh of the wind through the pines. Leanne sat rigidly, her knuckles white where she gripped the saddle. She had escaped, but to what? She had thrown herself at the mercy of a complete stranger, a man who lived like a hermit, a man whose name she didn't even know. The cold began to seep into her bones, her thin, torn dress offering no protection. She shivered, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. Without a word, Jonas shrugged out of his heavy, fleece-lined coat. It smelled of pine smoke, leather, and the clean scent of the cold. He draped it around her shoulders, his arms encircling her for a brief moment. The coat was immense, swallowing her small frame, but it was blessedly warm. The gesture was so simple, so devoid of any expectation, that it broke through her fear. It was an act of pure, uncomplicated kindness, the first she had known in so many months. As the snow began to fall, soft, thick flakes that muffled the world and erased their tracks, Leanne pulled the heavy collar of the coat up to her chin and leaned back, just slightly, against the solid form of the man who had, for now, saved her. The journey upward was long, a slow climb into a world of white and grey. The trail grew narrow, winding through dense forests of pine and fir, their branches heavy with accumulating snow. The air grew thinner, colder, purer. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the western sky, they arrived. Jonas's home was not a cave or a crude lean-to, as Leanne might have feared, but a small, sturdy cabin nestled in a protective hollow between three ancient pines. It was built of thick, dark logs, with a stone chimney from which a faint curl of smoke rose to meet the falling snow. It looked solid, safe, and profoundly peaceful. Jonas dismounted and then gently lifted her down, her legs unsteady after the long ride. He led Balthazar to a small, connected shed, then guided her to the cabin's single door. Inside, a wave of warmth washed over them. A fire was already burning low in the hearth, its embers glowing like sleepy red eyes. The cabin was one large room, with a packed earth floor covered by a few cured animal pelts. A rough-hewn table and two stools stood near the fire, a sleeping pallet was tucked into one corner, and shelves holding neatly stacked tins and jars lined one wall. It was Spartan, but it was immaculately clean and orderly. A small curtain partitioned off a tiny alcove, creating a separate space. Jonas gestured toward it. "That will be yours," he said, his voice quiet in the enclosed space. "There's a cot." It's not much. He didn't press her, didn't crowd her. He gave her space, turning back to the fire and adding a log, his movement slow and deliberate. Leanne went behind the curtain and found a narrow cot with a clean, folded blanket. It was a private space, a courtesy she hadn't been afforded in months. She sank onto the cot, the overwhelming reality of the day crashing down on her. Later, the smell of cooking stew filled the small cabin. Jonas worked at the hearth, adding vegetables from a crate into a pot. When it was ready, he ladled it into two wooden bowls and set them on the table. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the one on the trail. It was not tense or uncertain, it was calm, settled. The warmth of the fire, the simple, nourishing food, the quiet strength of the man across from her, it all began to slowly knit together the frayed edges of her soul. In the days that followed, a gentle routine formed. He never asked her for anything, but she found herself wanting to contribute. She found his sewing kit and mended the tear on her dress, then the rip in his sleeve Brody had made. She learned to keep the fire fed and to sweep the floor with a handmade broom. He would leave for hours at a time, checking traps or hunting, and always returned with food. He started speaking more, not in long conversations, but in small offerings. "That's a blue jay," he said one morning, pointing out the window. He told her his horse's name was Balthazar. He showed her how to grind coffee beans. These small moments were like seeds planted in the frozen ground of her heart, and slowly, tentatively, something began to grow. Weeks turned into a month. The snow piled deep outside the cabin, isolating them completely, cocooning them in a world of white silence. The cabin became a sanctuary, the fear of the outside world a distant memory. The quiet between them was now filled with a comfortable understanding. Leanne found herself watching him, the way he moved with such purpose, the way his brow would furrow in concentration as he repaired a snowshoe, the surprising gentleness in his large, calloused hands. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, rattling the small window pane, they sat by the fire. The flickering light cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The question had been sitting in her heart for weeks, and finally, she found the courage to ask it. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you help me?" Jonas stared into the flames for a long time, the firelight catching the deep lines etched around his eyes. He looked older in that moment, and sadder. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and heavy with memory. Because I couldn't stand the way they were looking at you, he began. Like you were a curiosity. A thing. Not a person. He shifted on his stool, the wood groaning under his weight. I wasn't always like this. I didn't always live up here. He paused, gathering his thoughts, unearthing a story he had kept buried for years. I had a family once. A wife, Anna. And a little girl. We were traveling out here from the east. Anna, she was from another country, like you. Her ways were different. People stared at her, whispered about her. They treated her like she was strange, fragile. But she was the strongest person I ever knew. His voice grew thick with emotion. There was a sickness in the camp. Cholera. It moved so fast. It took our daughter first. Then it took Anna. He fell silent, the only sound the howl of the wind and the crackle of the fire. Leanne felt tears well in her eyes, for this stranger's grief, a grief so profound it seemed to have a physical presence in the room. I was a carpenter, he continued, his voice rough. I could build a house with my bare hands. But I couldn't stop a fever. I couldn't save them. I felt useless. After they were gone, the world felt loud and cruel. The looks people gave me, the pity, it was worse than the silence. So I came up here. To be where it was quiet. He finally turned from the fire and looked at her, his gaze direct and filled with a raw, unguarded honesty. When I saw you in that street, kneeling in the mud, with him, with them all staring. I saw my Anna. I saw all the little cruelties she endured. And I couldn't just ride away. Not again. Saving you, maybe it doesn't change what happened. But it felt like a chance to do something right. To honor her, Leanne reached out, her small hand resting on his forearm. It was the first time she had initiated contact. He did not pull away. In that moment, the bond between them solidified, no longer just about protector and protected, but about two wounded souls finding solace in each other's presence. The heart of winter passed. The days, though still bitterly cold, began to hold a hint more light. Their life in the cabin had found a rhythm that was as peaceful and steady as a sleeping heartbeat. Leanne learned the names of the constellations Jonas pointed out in the clear, frigid night sky. He taught her how to recognize animal tracks in the snow. She, in turn, showed him how to fold paper into delicate shapes of birds and flowers, a small, beautiful art from her homeland that brought a touch of grace to the rustic cabin. The soft romance between them grew not in grand declarations, but in small, quiet gestures. It was in the way he would leave a mug of hot coffee on the table for her when she woke, and the way she would make sure his heavy coat was warming by the fire before he went out. It was in a shared smile over a successfully baked loaf of bread, or a lingering glance across the hearth. The memory of Sheriff Brody and the town had faded, softened by distance and the deep, insulating snow. The mountain had become their entire world, a fortress of solitude and peace. But peace is often a fragile thing. One afternoon, Jonas returned from checking his trap lines along the lower ridge, his usual calm demeanor gone, replaced by a grim, watchful tension. He said nothing as he stomped the snow from his boots and hung his rifle on its pegs, but Leanne felt the change in him immediately. The air in the cabin, once so comfortable, was suddenly charged with unspoken worry. Later that evening, as she was banking the fire for the night, he spoke. "I found tracks," he said, his back to her as he stared out the small window into the deep, impenetrable darkness. "Down by the South Pass. 2 horses. They're a few days old, but the snow was light there. They were heading this way." Leanne's blood ran cold. She stopped what she was doing, her hand hovering over the embers. "Brody," she whispered. Jonas nodded slowly. "He's a man who doesn't like to be made a fool of. And he's patient when it comes to getting what he thinks is his." He turned from the window, his face a mask of hardened resolve. He didn't want to frighten her, but he couldn't lie. The sanctuary was no longer secure. The outside world, with all its greed and cruelty, was climbing the mountain. That night, the peace was gone. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, sounded like a footstep. Jonas didn't sleep on his pallet. He sat in a stool by the door, his rifle across his lap, his gaze fixed on the entrance. He had brought her to his sanctuary to keep her safe, and now, the threat had followed them home. The quiet of the mountains no longer felt like a comfort, it felt like the silence before a storm. The storm arrived on a morning so bright and cold it hurt the eyes. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the sunlight glittered off the pristine snow, making the world look deceptively clean and pure. The crunch of hooves on the frozen crust of snow was the first warning, a sound that did not belong in their quiet world. Jonas was outside splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar part of their morning routine. He stopped mid-swing, his head lifting, every muscle in his body going still. He had been expecting this for days. He looked toward the cabin, where he could see Leanne's silhouette through the window, and his expression hardened. He placed the axe deliberately against the woodpile and walked to the cabin door, entering just as two riders emerged from the tree line. It was Sheriff Brody and a nervous-looking deputy, a hired man with shifty eyes who clearly wished he were somewhere else. They reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin, their breath misting in the sharp air. Brody swung down from his horse, a smug, triumphant look on his face. He had found them. "Jonas," he yelled, his voice thin and sharp in the vast silence. He strode forward, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "I know you're in there. And I know you've got her. I've come for what's mine. By the law of this territory, that girl is my property, and I'm here to collect." The cabin door opened. Jonas filled the entire frame, a silent, immovable object. He said nothing, simply stood there, blocking the way. Behind him, in the shadows of the cabin, Leanne appeared. She was terrified, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she did not hide. She stood behind the man who had become her shield. "She is not property," Jonas said, his voice as low and solid as the mountain around them. Brody laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Oh, she is. I've got a signed contract, stamped and legal. Her debt is to me. That makes her mine to do with as I please." He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being pulled back unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Now, I've come a long way. I'm cold, I'm tired, and I'm not in the mood for games. Step aside, or I swear I'll take her right over your dead body." The deputy shifted uneasily, his hand hovering near his own weapon, his eyes darting from Brody's pistol to Jonas's immense, unmoving form. The bright, beautiful morning had become a stage for a deadly confrontation. Jonas did not move. He seemed to absorb the threat, the cold metal of the pistol, the sheriff's ugly words, and remain utterly unchanged. His eyes were fixed on Brody, calm and unwavering. "You're not taking her," he stated again, not as a challenge, but as a simple, immutable fact. The air crackled with tension. Brody's finger tightened on the trigger, his face a mask of resentful fury. He was a man whose authority had been defied, whose pride had been wounded, and he was ready to reclaim it with violence. But then, something shifted. It was not Jonas who moved, but Leanne. She took a tentative step forward, emerging from the protective shadow of Jonas's body to stand beside him. She was trembling, but her chin was lifted. She looked directly at Sheriff Brody, the man who had terrorized her and treated her as less than human. For the first time, she was not his victim. "I am not a thing," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the snow with breathtaking clarity. "I am not a contract or a debt. I am a person." She took another small step, her gaze never leaving his. "And I choose to be here." Her defiance, her claiming of her own will, was more shocking to Brody than any physical threat. It was an idea so foreign to his view of her that it broke his composure completely. With a snarl of rage, he shifted his aim, leveling the pistol not at her, but at the true obstacle, Jonas. "Then you can die with him," he screamed. In the split second that Brody's arm moved, Jonas exploded into motion. His speed was terrifying for a man of his size. He didn't reach for his own rifle. He lunged forward, his left hand clamping down on Brody's wrist like a bear trap. The sheriff cried out in pain and surprise as Jonas twisted. The sound of bone grinding was sickeningly audible. The pistol clattered harmlessly onto the snow. Before Brody could even register what had happened, Jonas's other hand was on his chest, and he shoved. The sheriff flew backward, landing in a heap in a deep snowdrift, sputtering and gasping. The hired deputy, who had been watching with wide, terrified eyes, slowly raised his hands. "He ain't worth dying for, Sheriff," the man muttered, already backing his horse away. Defeated, humiliated, and disarmed, Brody scrambled out of the snow, clutching his injured wrist. He glared at Jonas with pure hatred, but the fight was gone from him. Jonas stood over Brody's fallen pistol, placing a heavy boot squarely upon it. "Go," Jonas commanded, his voice a low growl of finality. "And do not ever come back to this mountain without another word." Brody turned, stumbled to his horse, and rode away, a bitter, broken man swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. The sound of the retreating horses faded, leaving behind a silence that was deeper and more profound than any they had known before. The threat was gone. The world had come for them and had been turned away. Leanne stood on the snow-covered ground, breathing in the sharp, clean air, her heart a wild drum in her chest. She looked at Jonas, who was still standing over the discarded pistol, his broad back to her. He seemed like a titan, a guardian spirit of the mountain itself. He bent down, picked up the pistol, and with methodical movements, broke it open and emptied the cartridges into his hand. He turned and threw the bullets far into the trees, where they were swallowed by the snow. He then let the empty, useless weapon drop from his fingers. The confrontation was over. The violence was done. He turned to face her, and the hard, dangerous look in his eyes dissolved, replaced by a deep and gentle concern. He took a step toward her, his gaze searching her face. "Are you all right?" he asked. She could only nod, unable to find her voice. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving her shaking, not from cold, but from the sheer emotional weight of the moment. He reached out, his large hands hovering for a moment before he gently took her by the shoulders, his touch grounding her. He led her back inside the warm, safe walls of the cabin. The rest of the day passed in a quiet haze. They moved around each other, the unspoken emotions hanging thick and heavy in the air. The shared danger had burned away the last of the barriers between them, leaving only a raw and undeniable connection. That evening, they sat by the fire, the flames casting a warm, golden glow on their faces. The blizzard from weeks ago seemed a lifetime away. Outside, the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, cold and brilliant. The question she had asked in the mud of that town, a desperate plea for survival, now hung between them with an entirely new meaning. Jonas finally broke the silence, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He did not look at her, but at the dancing flames. "You asked me to marry you," he said quietly. Back in town he turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers. They were full of a hesitant, vulnerable hope. Is that still what you want?" Leanne looked at him, at this quiet, powerful man who had built a fortress of solitude from his own grief, and had torn it open to let her in. She saw the protector, the gentle soul, the lonely man who had seen her as a person when no one else had. A single tear escaped her eye, tracing a warm path down her cold cheek. She nodded, a small, certain movement. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But not to save me." Not anymore. Jonas's expression softened completely. For the first time since she had met him, a true, genuine smile touched his lips, transforming his rugged face. He reached out, his large, callous thumb coming up to gently brush the tear from her cheek. His touch was warm, and it spoke of a future, of a new beginning forged in the heart of the winter mountains. It was a promise of a home, not of sanctuary from the world, but of a world built for two. And as they sat there in the quiet firelight, they knew they had both, finally, found their way home.